The Red Army wanted a heavy tank with enough armor to be essentially impervious frontally to the German 88mm A8 gun as early as 1940. They did get the tank like this, only in 1943 with the IS-1. Unfortunately, the Germans at this point had developed more powerful weapons, in particular the Panther's 75mm gun and the longer 88mm gun on the Ferdinand. And so the Kirov Factory's SKB-2 Design Bureau got to work once again in 1943, this time on a Ferdinand killer. The new tank received the sequential index 701, and so it was referred to as Object 701. It was going to be about 10 tons heavier than the IS-2 at 55 tons. Most of this increase in weight went to the armor. The gun was considered fine. The 122mm gun could destroy the Ferdinand and any other German tank known at the time, so it was considered to be satisfactory. Auxiliary armament included a 12.7mm machine gun, which appeared on the IS-2 only in 1944, and a new kind of weapon, a 50mm bomb thrower that could shoot smoke grenades, which was very similar, conceptually at least, to the bomb thrower the British used in their tanks. The bulk of the work went into improving the armor. The front armor was now 120mm thick, just like the thickest part of the IS-2's armor, but the entire upper front hull had that same thickness, and it didn't have that weird step that the IS-2's hull had. As a result, it had an impressive line of sight thickness of 240mm. The sides weren't quite as heavily sloped. The upper sides were at 30 degrees, and the lower sides were vertical. But the thickness was considerably greater than that of the IS-2 at a whole 160mm. So, as you can see, the extra 10 tons really mostly went towards increasing the tank's armor. For a heavier tank, you needed a heavier engine, and so the Object 701 would have had an 800 or 850 horsepower engine to give it a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, which was considered satisfactory for a heavy tank. So interestingly enough, this tank was developed in complete secrecy. Even the People's Commissar of Tank Production, Vyacheslav Malyshev, only discovered the tank in December of 1943. Malyshev himself kept the tank secret and then pitched it to the tank directory only in March of 1944 when the design was essentially complete. The reason for this secrecy goes all the way back to 1942. In the summer of 1942, various Soviet tank factories started developing all sorts of new tanks, given the experience they received from the use of the T-34 and the KV-1 in the winter and spring of 1942, and Stalin told them to stop. The T-43 was nice and all. The KV-13 was a very interesting vehicle, but it didn't make any sense to switch to a whole production of a whole new tank, and in case of the KV-13, a whole new concept of a heavy tank with the weight of a medium. According to Stalin, the focus should have been on the T-34 and the KV. These designs were in production. They weren't perfect, but they worked, and so most of the energy needed to be put towards modernizing these tanks and keeping them useful in the battlefield. And then, so in 1943, to avoid a similar scolding, the factory, Kirov factory, wanted to keep their work under wraps at the very least until it was substantially complete. This gamble seemed to have paid off, since Stalin gave his permission to build 2 prototype tanks and an empty hull for penetration trials on April 8th of 1944. However, Stalin still didn't want to abandon existing tanks entirely, especially since the IS-2 had barely entered production at that point. The order gives a provision that components developed for the IS-4 had to be ported over to the IS-2 so that the tank is modernized in parallel with a development of its replacement. The first Object 701 was given the serial number 0. Object 701 number 0 was already visually different from the IS-2 tank. Of course, the shape of the hull was different, the shape of the turret was different. The hull was longer than the IS-2, and so it needed 7 road wheels per side instead of 6. Unfortunately for the Object 701 number 0, an 850 horsepower engine was not yet ready, and so it had to do with a supercharged IS-2 engine to putting out 750 horsepower. The gun was also different. It was still a 122mm gun with the same ballistics as the T-25, but the S-34 gun used on this tank did not have a muzzle brake. The Red Army didn't like muzzle brakes. They considered that the blast from the muzzle brake reveals a tank's position and is generally detrimental to any infantry that's close to your tank when you fire it. So the S-34 was preferred to the T-25T in that way. Object 701 number 0 was only going to be a test bed. The tanks that were going to be submitted for government trials were given the serial numbers 1 and 2. Object 701 number 1 was delivered on July 8, 1944, and Object 701 number 2 was delivered actually a little earlier on June 27th. Object 701 number 2 deviated from the design a little bit. It got a 100mm S-34-1 gun. Now, this tank shouldn't be confused with another tank called IS-4 that received a 100mm gun. That was a tank based on the IS-2 chassis, and it was a whole different prototype. It also shouldn't be confused with another IS tank, IS-5, that had the same S-34-1 gun. That was also another prototype on the IS-2 chassis. This was a time of great experimentation for the Red Army, but things did get a little bit confusing because the Kiev factory really liked reusing its prototype indexes. Anyway, the two Object 701s were put through government trials, and it turned out that they were quite unreliable. This was kind of to be expected. This was a whole new kind of tank with brand new components, and, well, it was considerably heavier than anything the Red Army had in the field up to that point. However, the design was still quite promising, and so even though there was a long laundry list of desired improvements, the Government Trials Commission expected to see the tank back at the proving grounds relatively quickly. In the meantime, the empty hull that was built for penetration trials was shut up, and, well, there was also some room for thought there. Even though the main armor plates stood up to 88mm guns quite well, there was some weak points. For instance, the bulge designed to house the gun sight was a weak point, and the driver's observation device was a weaker point as well. Both of these changes were included in the list of desired improvements for the next generation of Object 701 prototypes. As a result of these trials, Object 701 number 1 and 2 were taken apart completely and reassembled with new components as Object 701 number 5 and number 6. Object 701 number 4 was a completely new tank. It had a brand new hull and turret built with the improvements that were developed as a result of the penetration trials. The front armor on the hull was actually now even thicker. It was a whole 140 millimeters, still sloped at 60 degrees. Object 701 number 5 was put through 1,000-kilometer long reliability trials, taken apart for inspection, put back together, and then sent to the Kubinka Proving Grounds, where it went through another 1,000 kilometers of trials. The results were actually pretty good. It showed very high mobility, especially for a 55-ton heavy tank. It was just a hair faster than the IS-2 in comparable conditions, and thanks to its more advanced planetary gearbox, it was actually faster than even the T-34 on difficult off-road terrain, leaving the IS-2 in the dust. These trials ended on January 24th, 1945, and showed that the Object 701 was ready for prime time. It was suggested that a small batch of 25 to 30 pilot tanks could be built, and then mass production could begin in March or April. However, the Object 701 had one very powerful opponent. It was Vyacheslav Malyshev, the same man who proposed the tank to Stalin 1 year earlier. See, Malyshev was an experienced engineer, and he opposed putting a whole new tank into production at a very critical point in the war. According to Malyshev, the preferred version was the Object 703, which had heavier armor than the IS-2, but it still used the same automotive components from the IS-2, which were tried and tested, and therefore production could switch from IS-2 to Object 703 pretty quickly, and tanks could start being built without much of a delay. If you've seen my previous videos in the Panzer 46 series, you would know that Malyshev had his way, and the Object 703 was accepted into service as the IS-3. However, the Red Army still had their eyes on the heavier and theoretically more powerful Object 701. Malyshev sent the Object 701 back for even more trials, but even he couldn't kick the can down the road forever. In 1946, the IS-3 was taken out of production, and orders were given to replace it by the end of the year with the Object 701, which was accepted into service under the name IS-4. This is where the problems began. You see, the IS-4 was not just heavier, but also more complicated than the IS-3 tank. The weight actually increased since 1944. It went all the way up to 59 tons after all of the desired improvements were incorporated. And with weight and the complexity, an IS-4 tank cost as much as 3 T-54 tanks. To compare, during the war, a KV or an IS-2 would cost you about twice as much as a T-34, so proportionally the IS-4 was 50% more expensive. It's no wonder that only 6 IS-4 tanks were built in 1946 and only 57 in 1947 out of a quota of 200 vehicles. The heavier tank also turned out to be quite a bit more troublesome than prototypes suggested, and so in 1949 Malyshev killed the IS-4 once and for all. Orders were given to cap development of any future heavy tanks at 50 tons, and so the IS-5 that came to replace the IS-4 followed the concept of the IS-3 tank rather than the IS-4, which was considered to be a failure. However, this was not yet the end for the IS-4. All IS-4 tanks that had been built by that point were modernized to make the IS-4M. Every single IS-4 was modernized by 1951, but at that point, the tank wasn't really needed anywhere, and they were sent to long-term storage. When the USSR's relationship with China began to cool and more forces were needed on the far eastern border, the IS-4M was once again retrieved from storage and deployed there, but only briefly as a tank. The process of turning these tanks into immobile bunkers began pretty soon, and, well, a large portion of IS-4s that survive until today had their engines and running gear removed and were dug in as stationary emplacements. The IS-4M tanks were officially written off in 1997, having never seen battle. As you can see, Malyshev was right. The best tank for the Red Army in 1945 was not the IS-4, but the IS-3. This tank might have had thinner armor than the IS-4, but it was also lighter, faster, more reliable, and, well, most importantly, production could begin without having to take a long pause to retool the USSR's heavy tank factories. The IS-4 was, of course, interesting, but this is not a tank that one would want to switch to in the middle of a war. So would the IS-4 had seen service if the war had lasted for a couple of more years? Well, almost certainly not. Malyshev's argument was ironclad, and if the war had continued, the Red Army would have most likely stuck with the IS-3. However, the IS-4 was not entirely a waste of time, because as I mentioned, according to Stalin's orders, solutions developed for the IS-4, or rather the Object 701, were actually ported over to the IS-2, and the modernizations performed in the IS-2 in 1944 actually are owed to the Object 701 project. The resemblance can be seen particularly in the front hull and the driver's observation device in the IS-2 that was produced starting in 1944. So even though ultimately the IS-4 was a failure, it was not a complete waste of time, and it did have its own way of positively impacting Soviet tank development and making its own contribution to victory.